Now, previously we've been talking about iOS_config. What if we start looking at other platforms like Arista EOS and Nexus NXOS, and you could expand this and look at Junos or something else as well. But here, let's look at a playbook that has iOS_config, EOS_config, and NXOS_config. So if I start at the top, you're going to see that I have this name string. I'm executing it on this host. Now I've moved my provider. Where have I moved my provider? I've moved my provider into, and actually let me move that directory up. I've moved that provider into cisco.yml, and here you can see my provider is being defined. Basically, I want to start decluttering my playbook to make it simpler. And I'll talk about this here in a little bit. Similarly, I've moved I'm going to go ahead and remove that for a minute. So let me go into my group vars. And let me go ahead and make copies of all these. Okay. Basically, I want to make these simpler and remove some items from it. So cisco.yml doesn't have this global config. All we have is the SSH provider. Similarly, arista.yml doesn't have this global config. All we have is an SSH provider and an EAPI provider. And these should be pretty much identical to what you saw in class 2. And then finally, NXOS config has a provider for SSH and it has a provider for NX API. So we go back into our playbook, we look back at our playbook, and we see here we're calling with a provider. Where is it pulling this? It's pulling this from group vars. Now let's go ahead and look at group vars all.yml. Here's where we define our name server, our default domain, and our NTP1 and NTP2. Those variables are going to apply to all the devices. And then here we see our lines. So for Cisco, we're going to be doing the following, similar to what we saw in a previous class. We get down to our second play. Now notice we have the problem here that this requires the iOS config module. This requires the EOS config module. So I could have done this as separate tasks and then specified a conditional inside the task. So for example, here I could have added a when statement and done something where it was basically saying when vendor equals Cisco. Like down here, I could have done something where I'm basically saying when vendor equals Cisco in some way. And then I could have tried to done EOS config right here with its provider and its lines when vendor equals Arista. Instead of doing that, I think it's more logical. And in that situation, I also would have had to update the hosts to add the Arista and to add the Nexus. Instead of doing that, I think it's more logical to have separate plays here. Here's the play with the Cisco devices. I don't have any conditional in it, and I specify the Cisco module. I get down to line 14, and I have the play with the Arista devices. Here, just this one Arista switch, and I specify the EOS config module. And I'll go ahead and get rid of this EOS tag. And then finally, I specify the play with the NXOS config module running against NXOS1. In this case, I'll actually leave the tags NXOS1, and then here's my config lines. Now notice there's some slight variations in the config. So here's the Cisco lines. For Arista, I needed to specify the VRF, so I specified the VRF default for the name server. So it comes across like that. In NXOS, the name server actually adds them as individual lines. It took them if I configured them this way, but when they showed up in the config, the multiple name servers would show up this way. So in order to make it idempotent, i.e. if I run the playbook multiple times, it doesn't think it needs to redo the commands, I'm going to set it up in the way that it actually shows up in the running config. Now let's go ahead and execute this playbook. Here we see it's running for Cisco IOS. We see it already has those config elements. Here we see it running for EOS config. Ignore that warning. That's, I think, a bug in Ansible. And then here we see it running for NXOS. If I go to my other window, let's go ahead and do netmiko grep, and we'll operate this against, we'll say domain. We'll operate this against the PyNet router 1, see what we get. We see the domain name is set to this bogus.com. If I look up the name server, we see the two name servers. If I look at the NTP server, we see the two NTP servers. I could look at Arista similarly, but let me go ahead and look at NXOS1. There's the configuration for NXOS1. For NTP servers, look at the name server. There we have the name server, and you can see they're there. It's in this slightly different syntax where it has name server 1 and name server 2. And let me look at the domain. There we see our bogus.com. So we have those items configured on the iOS device, the EOS device, and the NXOS device. We're using the corresponding platform underscore config module to accomplish that. Now, if we copy this playbook into a second playbook and we start modifying it in a slight way. Now let me talk about how I want to modify it. First of all, I don't really like that I have all these config lines directly embedded in the playbook. I think it's a good practice if you start trying to separate your data from your script. So here are things we're trying to config on the router. I really want those to be not included in my script. I want them to be variables in some way that I'm just executing. So I want to move these either to somewhere in the inventory. And in this case, I'm going to start moving this to the group vars. So I'll do group vars, and this is for Cisco. and I'll make some sort of a variable. I'm going to make a global config variable here, and I'll just clean this up a little bit. So I'm going to have a global config variable that's a list. That list has 5 elements, look exactly like this. I go back into my playbook. Now my lines are not going to refer to all the lines explicitly. Instead, I'm going to refer to global config. And to sanity check that, let me just run that playbook. Make sure it still runs and that Ansible thinks everything is configured properly. It does. So I go back in here. I'm going to copy these 5 lines. Go into my group vars arista.yaml. Make a variable there called global config. Paste these 5 lines in. Clean this up a little bit. Okay, so I have a variable called global config, which has those 5 lines in it. Go back into my playbook, delete that, copy this. We're just going to use the global config variable and not all of the individual lines. And finally, we'll repeat that process for the Nexus device. Make our global config variable. Clean it up. Okay, so our global config there looks like that. It's getting these other variables from somewhere else in inventory. In this case, it's getting all these from the all.yaml file. Go back here. Remove that, copy this. So now our playbook looks quite a bit more simplified. We can see our 3 individual plays. Here's the provider, here's the lines. In each case, we're using the global config. There's a slight difference with the Nexus in that we have this tags. So we'll do Ansible playbook. Go ahead and execute it. We can see the iOS config happening, the EOS config happening, and the NXOS config. All of those modules properly detect that they have everything already configured, so they don't have to make any changes. Now the tag that I created here, so this tags NXOS, allow me to rerun my playbook and to specify the tag, but to only execute some specific task or some specific play. So here, I'm only going to run the one play. And let's look at what happened here. So it says play iOS config. It says task gathering facts. So it gathers the facts, but it doesn't actually execute the play. So it doesn't actually execute the iOS underscore config module. Same with EOS. It does the fact gathering, but it doesn't execute the EOS underscore config. And then finally, here we get to the NXOS change, where it does the fact gathering, and here, since we're running the NXOS tag, it does NXOS underscore config. If we want to make it a little bit clearer, we can set gather facts to be false for all 3 of these. re-execute this with the NXOS tag, and look at what we see. So it prints out the string, but it doesn't execute anything because those tags, there's no tag in those sections for what we're doing. We're only doing the NXOS tag, so we only execute this play and this task. So tags can be useful for executing part of your playbook. Now let's copy this mp config 2.yaml and actually make a mp config 3.yaml. Go ahead and execute, or excuse me, modify part of this playbook. And now I don't want this to execute just on PyNet router 1. I want to execute on the whole Cisco group, which is PyNet router 1 and router 2. I want to execute this on the whole Arista group, which is 4 Arista switches. And similarly here, I want to execute this on the entire Nexus group, which is 2 Nexus switches, and I remove that tag. So we're just broadening out which set of devices we're executing these global config changes on. So this will encompass a total of 9 devices, 2 Cisco IOS, 4 Arista EOS, 2 Nexus switches. So those total of 8 devices. Rerun our playbook and watch that config change occur. So PyNet router 1 and 2 are already correct. The EOS switches were already correct for all 4. The Nexus switches were already correct for those 2 Nexus. So you can see we executed on those 8 total devices. If we update something, like let's make the domain name not be bogus.com, but we'll make it bogus1.com. Re-execute our playbook. You'll see we're changing router 1, router 2. We're going to start changing all of the Arista switches. Change those 4 Arista switches, and it changed the 2 Nexus switches. Now one thing to note here is that Ansible is going to have, by default, 5 forks that run in parallel. So, and it does this play by play. So it executes this play, and there's up to 5 forks. Now there's only 2 devices, so it's going to do PyNet router 1 and PyNet router 2 at the same time. It gets down to here, and it's going to have up to 5 forks once again. So it'll operate on Arista 1, or excuse me, Arista 5, Arista 6, Arista 7, Arista 8 at the same time. And then finally, it'll proceed down to here, and it'll do NXOS 1 and NXOS 2 at the same time. So the plays will be sequential, i.e. one after another, but inside each play, it'll parallelize for multiple hosts, and by default, up to 5 forks. So if the Cisco group was 5 Cisco devices, it would do them all simultaneously in parallel. Now you can add an argument where you increase the number of forks. Here I'm going to increase it up to 10 forks to parallelize it if you had more than 5 devices that you wanted to do at the same time. And there we can see that everything is already properly configured.